welcome to the 27th PAVE Europe virtual panel. My name is Guido Di Pasquale. I'm Managing Director of PAVE Europe. And today we talk about regulation on the AV space, from national approaches to EU ambitions, shaping the future of AV regulation. I won't be the moderator today. We have a special guest, Tobias Reich, who is managing partner at Reich Autonomy in Stuttgart, and he was also associated with P3, a member of PAVE Europe, and he is also a very good friend of us. Why Tobias? Tobias is working for the European Commission on the regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles, currently on the topics of cross-border ADS testing and ADS fitness of existing regulations. He also served more than 25 years in leadership position in the various well-known automotive OEMs industries, and he has worked in various countries in Europe, UK, Germany, France, Spain, and he has a big passion for Europe and for making autonomous driving a reality. So we are both passionate about that. And with this, Tobias, welcome again, and thank you for accepting this invitation to moderate this great panel session. Over to you to introduce the guests and the panel, and then I will join you back at the end of our webinar today. Thanks.
Thank you, Guido. Very, very nice words. Thank you very much. I'm honored to moderate this panel, and I would like to say hello to the panelists. I think we have a great panel here together for our topic of AV regulations. So what's the objective today? What are the goals? As we all know, it takes various things for a successful deployment of AVs in Europe. Technology needs to be mature and safe. That's sure. Then deep pockets probably by the companies who wanted to do that, because payback can be long, as we have learned now. And thirdly, we need a regulatory framework. No, we need laws allowing these vehicles on our roads in Europe. And at least here we can say that Europe is not behind the other world regions. I think Europe is in a leading position here. We have a regulatory framework on an EU level and on a national level, and that's something we want to talk about today. But it's a complicated business, no? I mean, the framework is about type approval, maybe on a European level, but then we also need national regulations allowing these driverless vehicles on our roads and into specific operational design domains. And then maybe if we talk about robotaxis, for example, we also might need a local licensing process, and that needs to be regulated as well. So that's quite complicated, but I think we have a perfect panel together to discuss this complicated topic and to shed some light on the state of play and the future of regulations for AVs in Europe. And with this, I would like to introduce the panels and ask them to introduce themselves. And let's start with the male panelist, Stefan, if you can go first.
Thank you, Tobias. My pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm Stefan Diening. I'm the head of the Division for Autonomous Driving, Digitization of Mobility and ITS in the German Ministry of Transport. Now, that's a new name and a new ministry because you know that the German government was just currently formed anew after our federal elections, and we split up the digitization part into a new ministry. I most certainly will remain with my topic of autonomous driving in the Ministry of Transport, and I'm looking forward to continuing in the subject matter. My pleasure to be here today. I've worked in this field for a number of years. By profession, I'm a lawyer. So that it comes with the regulatory challenges. And I'm glad to be here and looking forward to our panel and discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Stefan. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Well, thank you. Really excited to be here. So I'm Sarah Gates, Director of Public Policy at PAVE. PAVE is the developer of end-to-end artificial intelligence software, which will power all automation levels of vehicle from level 2 ADAS to level 4 fully driverless vehicles. PAVE's a global company. We're currently testing in the UK, a number of locations in Western Europe, including Germany, where we recently opened a new office near Stuttgart. We're also in the US and Japan. So we have a lot of experience navigating, at least testing regulations so far in different locations globally.
Yes, Sarah. Elsa, you want to go next?
Thanks, Tobias. So I'm Elsa Lano, working for the French Ministry for Transport on the department responsible for the national strategy for the development of automated road mobility in France, and in charge of the regulatory framework also. And I'm personally involved in safety regulation activities, especially on the safety demonstration framework and participating in EU and UNICE regulation fora. And looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Elsa. Christina, do you want to go next?
Thank you and good morning to everyone. So thank you for having me today as part of this very interesting and varied panel. My name is Maria Cristina Galassi and I'm team leader for the digital transition of the automotive and mobility industry unit in DG GROW, where DG GROW stands for the Directorate General of the European Commission for Internal Market, Industries, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. One of the main files of my team is, of course, related to driving automation. So what we do is that we are in charge of the regulatory developments for assisted and automated driving. So we take part in leading the work at the EU level, but we also contribute to the work ongoing at UN level. And I'm sure we will have the opportunity to further discuss that during this 1 hour of time we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Actually, I would like to start the panel discussion with you because EU level is definitely the highest level we're talking about here and has impacts, of course, onto the member state regulations. And if we want to understand the state of play and the future of regulations, it's maybe good to learn a little bit about the history. And since 2022, there is a EU type approval regulation for autonomous mobility, the 2022-1426 regulation, which is limited to small series. And I would be interested in hearing from you, what's the history of that regulation? How did it come about? And what was the intention of that?
Sure. So thank you for the question. I will give a bit of historical background about that. So we started working on this regulation back in 2020. At that time, we were involved in the preliminary work at UN level for developing safety requirements and validation methods for automated driving systems. And some work had already been done and delivered, but then the contracting parties didn't agree on the maturity of that work to deliver a UN regulation. So also looking at the European panorama, we observed that member states and Germany and France were, of course, the first ones there, were already preparing their national framework. So we understood there was the need also to harmonize at European level, building on what was already done at national level. And that's a little bit explains the genesis of this European text. So on one side, the need to harmonize at European level. On the other side, also the need to have type approval regulation in place, because indeed there was no full agreement at the United Nations level on that. This regulation builds on the experience done by Germany and France back in 2020 already, and also applies the principles that were already developed and available at UN level. So we have full alignment with those that are already also today used to develop the future UN regulations. Why the small series? So the reason for that is twofold. So we are dealing with this regulation for the type approval of fully driverless vehicles. So the use cases covered are robotaxis, shuttles, automated valet parking, and hub-to-hub applications. This means that indeed we do not have, and we did not have back then, a type approval framework fit for these driverless vehicles. Some of our regulations, for example, for steering and braking, still refer to the human driver, also doing the testing for compliance assessment, for example, or to steering wheels or to the force applied on pedals and so on and so forth. And so this small series scheme allowed the introduction of exemptions, like specific rules are applicable for driverless vehicles instead of the rules contained in these regulations. And these rules, indeed, the exceptional rules were delivered through a delegated act to amend Regulation 858. So this was one of the reasons why we introduced a small series scheme. But on the other side, we also understood that indeed we were pioneering in regulating and innovative technologies, and no regulators had experience on that. So to reassure citizens and regulators, we decided to adopt an incremental approach. So we imagined that indeed we could possibly apply the new also safety requirements and new validation methods to an initially small fleet of these new vehicle technologies. And this was, again, an advantage of introducing the small series scheme, which allows 1,500 registrations per model per year. At the same time, we understood, also in following up discussions with our stakeholders, that indeed for some use cases this scheme was providing indeed a useful first step to market introduction. For other use cases more oriented towards like private vehicles ownership, that was not sufficient enough, and that's why some of our players are still waiting for us to lift this small series limitation and move to unlimited series approval to deliver their new technologies to the market. And that's where we are at now. So we are working full speed to lift the small series scheme, starting with automated valet parking this year and the other use cases the next year. And of course, this is strictly linked also to the ongoing work to update the type approval framework. So all the other non-automated driving system regulations to make them fit for the approval of automated vehicles. So that's a bit in a nutshell, the historical background for our regulatory work. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I think that's a lot of information and good information to understand the history of that European type approval regulation for autonomous mobility. And you mentioned that Germany and France were all first and already there basically with ideas for regulations and regulations. So let's ask Stefan from Germany basically, what are your experience with the German regulation, and how do you see the cooperation with the EU Commission on that topic?
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you, Christina. So to give you a bit of an overview of that maybe we'll start with actually what we did in Germany to so that everybody's clear and what the legal structure is like. We started amending our Road Traffic Act already in 2017 for vehicles with a level 3 systems. And that took a while until the first cars actually hit the road with this level, but the framework was there already in 2017. And we continued, did another amendment to the Road Traffic Act in 2021, 25 is now, which then enabled cars with a level 4 technology to be on the road. And that legal, this law, the Road Traffic Act, was supplemented with an ordinance for the regulation and the operation of motor vehicles in 2022. So ever since, we had the real, and we have and had the real framework in place, not only for testing, but actually, and that's important, for real life and real operations on public roads, because that's an important an important goal that we have we want to move from testing to real operations, which is, I think, important both on the society level, all the benefits that we have, and also, of course, for industry, to create and make sure that Europe is a hub for autonomous industry. Out of that comes more or less an approval procedure in 3 steps. You start with the vehicle approval, which is done by our KBA. So on the federal level, the Federal Motor Transport Authority, known to probably most of you if you know our scene and our structure in Germany. And then you need, in a second step, to have the determination and approval of the operating area, and that's done by local and by state law. And you need to, that's then sort of directed not on the federal level but by the states, to find the appropriate authority who then approves the ODD for you. Well, and then once you have the car approved by the KBA and you have the ODD, which is approved by the local municipality, then you register the car, and then with a technical oversight, of course, which is also important, then you start and are able to start driving. Now, as I said, the KBA grants the approvals, and you can look that up actually to all of you. They actually published a list of the approvals online. The KBA does it. You can always look at the refreshed list. I think there's over 20 approvals so far, and a few still pending. So it's moving, and it's moving in the right direction, I might say. All of these approvals are, however, testing and trial permits. So I'm really looking forward to having real time and real operation permits in place. We were, as you pointed out, Tobias, and Christina elaborated a bit on sort of the history of how things fell into place on the national level and on the European level. Very quick and soon with a national regulation, but what we are waiting for now, of course, is, and happy that we have Sarah here as well, we're looking for industry to actually develop vehicles that actually hit the road. So meanwhile, and since we have the regulation in place, we supplemented our legal framework a bit with other items, and the most recent one was a national strategy for autonomous driving that was actually published by the federal government in December, and that's there actually, as we say it, to breathe life into the legal framework and to help industry overcome all the challenges that we have. It's very comprehensive, and I could probably spend a long time talking about this, which I will not do unless there are specific questions. But of course, the idea is to say, okay, we really want an ecosystem for autonomous driving, and we want to make sure that in addition to all the legal framework, industry says, okay, we're here, we're ready to hit the road. If I may say, a short wish list to the Commission. There's actually 3 steps, which are of no surprise to Christina, as we keep on repeating them. Of course, the small series limitation is one of the issues that we would like to the Commission to move forward with. That is to actually erase the small series limitation, because we think it's important for the scaling and the growth actually of the AV industry here in Europe. We would like to make sure that the Commission works on a comprehensive and also on a complementary legal framework. So if, as it was mentioned, there is legal frameworks, national frameworks that are in place, we want to use them, we want to try them out, we want to actually see how they go, and we also want to communicate to the Commission our experiences, so the experiences can actually flow and enter into the European regulation. But we want to make sure that there is no limit to what we do nationally before there is a comprehensive legislation in place, which is of course important because for industry, yet again, you will need to cross borders, and that's probably best done with a European comprehensive framework. So that's that in a longer nutshell, but we're looking forward to having more and more autonomous vehicles hit the road all over Europe.
Thank you, Stefan. Very insightful, and I could give you the opportunity later to expand a little bit on the plans of the new government, basically for deployment. But first, let's hear from Elsa. I mean, France was about the regulation in France was about the same time as the German one, but has a slightly different approach with the so-called transport systems. Maybe Elsa, you can explain us a little bit the philosophy and history of the French regulation.
Yeah, thanks, Tobias, and thanks for my colleagues from Germany, Stefan, for explaining the German regulation, so I can just present the French one while trying to make some comparison with that. So maybe I can begin by speaking about the national strategy. That you might know that France has a national strategy since 2018, and that strategy has been revised 2 times, and the last version is to be published quite soon. So, and as part of that strategy, the regulation was one of the main priorities to be able to reach the deployment of AVs in our roads. So we had before then a regulation for the testing regime, but it was applied to prototypes vehicles and for innovation and research perspective, and we tried to move forward with that regulatory framework, and that framework was built in a complementary approach to the EU vehicle type approval regulation that has been so, as Christina mentioned, since 2020. And so in that framework, the basis was that we rely on the vehicle type approval. That is the first part of the French regulation. And once the vehicle has been type approved at the EU level, we developed a process under the French framework to authorize the driving of those vehicles in a transport system without a driver on board. So if I go into more detail on the different use cases that we are addressing in France, we have, as Germany, presented 2 kinds of concepts. The traffic code that concerns the driving of private vehicles on the road, but on that side, there is still a driver on board, and we allow only partially automated vehicles or highly automated vehicles to be deployed. And on the other side, we have the fully automated framework, in the sense that there is no more driver on board, but there is the concept of remote intervention, and that operator is responsible to of the safety of the driving of the global transport system when deployed on the road. So if I go back to this framework for the deployment of automated vehicles, the concept of the safety demonstration framework was designed to have very high level requirements on the safety of those transport system, in the sense that this vehicle has been type approved at the EU level, and then we established a lot of guidance at the national level. Those guidance are performed and realized in conjunction with our industry to be able to build a certain numbers of standards on description, on the scenario approach. We've been talking a lot about that approach, and on the processes to put in place to be able to validate and to assess the systems. And at the end, it also a piece of comparison to the German approach. The local authority is responsible for the commissioning of the transport system and the transport service to put it on the road. So if I may resume that approach, the French approach to safety has been built to complement the EU regulation on the vehicle type approval to install a sort of safety demonstration to provide a sort of complement approach. It's not a duplication, it's not a double check of the vehicle type approval, but it's to show and to be able to demonstrate that this vehicle, when integrated in a transport system, is capable to to be integrated on the road safely. So, for example, we are going to ask if the remote center is well designed and is it safe to interact with the type-approved vehicle, and this kind of operational safety measures.
Thank you, Elsa. Very comprehensive system. So from the outset, it looks quite good. We have a European type approval regulation. We have national regulations in the biggest countries allowing these vehicles on the road. Let's ask Sarah from WAVE. I mean, she's representing an applicant who has some experience also with these permits for testing mainly, I think. Sarah, how do you live and experience these regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, so I think, you know, you can even tell in the sort of high level summary you gave it, Tobias, that it's fairly complicated. So when you're dealing with I guess a supranational type approval framework, and then you need to interact with often individual national governments, and then also at state and local level, it's incredibly difficult for companies to navigate. You know, I guess you could take our experience in testing regulations as a sort of a primer for some of the complications we would have at full commercial deployment. So I guess it's useful to explain the difference for the audience. There's a lot of the time when we discuss regulation for AVs, we're talking about when you actually type approve a vehicle and you're you know, selling it on the open market or deploying a transport service. But actually, most of the AVs are available in the wild or in testing form, and they're being developed still. The technology, despite now about 15 years of development, is still not widely available, and actually it's going through, particularly at the moment, going through a very big change in how the technology is being developed. So typically we've seen the regulations develop around an older way of developing the technology, which is very much around programming technology, relying on high definition maps, and therefore creating quite static geofenced deployments, often vertically integrated. So when I say vertically integrated, I mean that you are basically designing a vehicle for a particular use case. The industry has moved on quite significantly, particularly in the last 3 to 5 years, because it's incredibly difficult to create business models off that kind of older approach. It's obviously not how vehicles are developed and sold today. We develop vehicles for a wide range of use cases. So if you have a light commercial van or a HGV, they can be used in lots of different locations for lots of different purposes. And that's how you make money from transport technology. And that's also how we want to facilitate AV business models. Unfortunately, when we look at the older approaches of building the tech, it's because it's focused on these kind of like, you know, mapped areas, we've often thought about the regulation in kind of static areas. So increasingly, the technology is moving much more towards using artificial intelligence. So WAVE has pioneered end-to-end artificial intelligence since 2017. But you know, really worth saying that WAVE's not the only one now using artificial intelligence as the predominant way of building this technology. And what that means is the industry is relying less and less on high definition maps and very much trying to move away from that because it's simply too expensive. Which means we're building technology that can work across borders and work at a much, I guess, greater distribution of scenarios, because that's what you need to be able to do to deploy technology in a broad range of roads. And it means we don't need to map locations. So the reason I gave all of that background is because we need to develop regulation that facilitates cross-border and large-scale services that are not targeted at one use case. And I think some of the challenge we have, particularly both in testing and commercial deployment, is this push towards enabling certain use cases. Now, typically when governments try to do that, they're trying to preempt where the market will go, and that's never usually a good way of building regulation. And what you actually want to do is facilitate the technology. So that's to say, I guess my main concern around the current state of the European regulatory framework is that it will be really, really complicated to introduce commercially viable services. It's particularly concerning when we talk about introducing extra checks at local level, not because local authorities in local areas shouldn't be involved. They absolutely should in kind of deciding whether they want the technology and feeling brought along. But I think we can all agree there are not kind of an abundance of AV experts globally, and not an abundance of people who can make decisions on what is safe and not safe. And so there would be some concern that introducing those extra checks at local level, they just won't be able to do them, like from a very practical practical kind of experience working with local regulators. They don't have all of the latest kind of understanding, because how would they? Like, most people don't. And we really see that when we've gone around trying to get different testing permits in Europe. There's a lot of focus on what your end goal is, so what your end SAE level is, instead of actually thinking about whether the underlying kind of technology that you're trying to test is safe. So something we have been really challenged with is we're building a foundation model that, once engineered into a base vehicle, can power any level of automation. And our business model is very much about selling that technology to vehicle manufacturers. And I think you'll increasingly see that business model is now becoming more common in the industry, because again, it actually brings us to a viable business case. But we have spent, I can't imagine how many hours trying to kind of battle with individual regulators on what SAE level we are building, just so we can test it with a vehicle safety operator behind the wheel. And I would love to see us move away from this kind of over focus on the end outcome and focus a lot more on the underlying technology, so that we're not trying to second guess what companies are trying to do. And that's how you build innovation friendly regulation, right? Where you're not trying to guess where the market is going to go.
Thank you, Sarah. Very, very interesting. Can I take your points to Stefan, for example? Stefan, if you wanted to react to that, in Germany, you explained there is a 3-level process basically involving the KBA and also the Länder, the state level, which was criticized by Sarah. Any reaction to that?
Oh, I wouldn't take that as criticism, because we are talking frequently with industry. It's probably fair to say that's also not the first conversations that Sarah and I are having about this subject. And what you need to keep in mind is that we have a bit of a different role as, let's say, the public administration. We are there to enable business models, yes, but the business model itself is sort of for the industry to develop. I would like to point out that our regulation is basically use case agnostic, first of all, so all use cases are possible. When we get to the strategy later, I could probably maybe point out to some of the aspects about what use cases we think might be in need of support, but that's a different aspect. You always need to, and that's of course the role of governments, of administrations, to take the people that on the ground, the people in the local municipalities along, and actually not so much only in a sort of a societal way, that everybody likes and approves, even though that's important. In my view, it's important that people use, feel, see, experience the technology to actually know that it's safe if it enters the market, but also to actually see that the car can safely operate where it actually wants to operate. After all, once it's there, once it's approved. So I do understand the point and the challenge that the industry has, but I don't think it can't be overcome. The question of which level you have approved by the respective authority it might be a tricky one, but at the end it's also hard for an approval authority per se to not know what they're actually approving. There needs to be the sort of the clearness of you want approval for this, and this is what you get. You can't have an approval for this and have something else come out at the end. There are specific intricacies to the German approval process, which Sarah is probably talking about, which might be too detailed for the purpose of this conversation. I know that the question of, between levels 2+ and 4, there's long ways, which is probably what Sarah was alluding to. But to come to your original question, Tobias, it's not that much of a criticism, but it's a challenge that industry poses and industry actually asks, and justifiably so. And we need to answer that as administrations, regulators, governments, and also, of course, lawmakers, for whom I'm not speaking at this point. But I think it can be done. But what is important is that there's a continuous dialogue and that there is no monolithic framework in place while technology moves either somewhere else or forward in a different manner. So it's important to be in a continuous exchange, and I think that's a dialogue at least I can say that for most of the people here in the pictures and in this on this panel, are continuously having almost on a daily basis, I would say.
Thank you, Stefan. I see, Christina, you want to react as well, and I think you're well placed also to comment on the question of cross-border facilitation.
Yes, indeed. So first of all, I would want to highlight that indeed the Commission is not using in its regulation the SAE levels. So we agree that this is misleading. The main difference is between assisted and automated driving, simply because of the safety concept involving or not involving the human driver, which is a fundamental difference. And this is also in a way discriminating how the system is assessed then. So we are trying to implement similar methodologies, but of course the difference of having the human in the loop is a fundamental difference that has to be taken into account. But I agree that more flexibility is needed, and technology openness as well, or technology neutrality, as we used to say, regulation. So it's not up to the regulators to set the boundaries for the technologies or to indeed indicate use cases. And indeed, we are moving far from the definition of use cases in the upcoming UN regulations for automated driving systems. Further to that, I really believe that cross-border mutual recognition will be fundamental aspects for our work in the future. Starting already today, because at present, you, Tobias, very well know, we are already starting discussion on these aspects. And the mutual recognition of services approved across Europe is already happening and is fostered in other sectors. The single market strategy has just recently been released a few days ago, and it clearly indicates that this should be considered also as a viable step for the future of services provided through autonomous vehicles, automated and autonomous vehicles. So this means that indeed we are going to work on these aspects. Of course, member states and local authorities will be involved in the discussion, will have still their responsibilities for indeed the licensing of the transport services, but we will boost the establishment of an internal market for these services as well. So it's not, as Sarah mentioned, it's not thinkable that a single operator, a transport operator, or a vehicle manufacturer could undergo not even 27 times transport licensing, but even more depending on each and every city they want to deploy. So we need to find a solution to that, and we are starting the discussion to get to a common solution, common agreement right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. That sounds encouraging. You also mentioned before that the small series limitation might be lifted through the work on UNEC level. Can you also explain a little bit the time plan you have there? When do you think this limitation can be lifted?
So we are working on two separate work streams there, in the sense that As I mentioned, we are contributing to the preparation of UN regulation on automated driving system approval. And this will not refer to use cases and will not refer to small series at all, because that doesn't exist at the UN level, it just exists at European level. And this is expected to be approved by June 2026 and enter into force beginning of 2027. At the same time, we are in the process of lifting the small series scheme on our EU regulation, so that in case of delays or problems with the delivery of the UN regulation, we will have indeed unlimited series approval possible also in Europe already starting this year for automated parking and next year for the other use cases that we refer to. But the ideal outcome will be to have the UN regulation in place by 2026. And this is associated to what you refer to, also to the work on the amendment of more than 100 regulations to make our framework fit for driverless vehicles.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Ambitious plan, but if it comes to fruition, then by 2026 there would be a regulation without limitation, which obviously would be great also for industry. But let me ask Elsa first. Elsa, what is your experience in France with the applications, and what are your expectations from applicants like WAVE, for example? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can try to do it. So maybe there is 2 points to that question. On the local authority side, that the regulatory regime is based on the commissioning and on the commitment of local authorities to commission and to authorize the driving of automated road transport systems. So as Sarah already mentioned, it's a really huge challenge to involve and to commit PTAs to CCAM and to deliver some authorization to the deployment of those vehicles, in the sense that they are not really involved in that process and on the safety issue. So it's why we also in France created the notion of independent assessor to those systems, in the sense that those local authorities have to rely on the assessment of an external body responsible for the safety assessment. So on the other side, there is also the issue on how to get type-approved vehicles in Europe, because the regulatory framework is based on the fact that the vehicle is type-approved at the EU level. So I think that to correctly answer the question, we have to find an in-between, of the testing regime and the regulatory framework. Until we have some type-approved vehicles, we can't be able to move to the deployment regime. So we are trying to work on an incremental regime to have some safety assessment on specific vehicles to be able to allow the testing regime to go forward, because the main limitation of the testing regime is that there is in France no safety guards, if I may say that. So we are trying to move forward to have some specific safety validation to be able to move forward to has an incremental approach to the deployment.
Thank you, Elsa. Sarah, now you've heard Germany, France, and also the EU Commission reacting a little bit to your points. What do you say? I mean, does that correspond to your wish list of how to remove further roadblocks in the regulatory framework, or what would be concrete requirements that you would have?
I don't know. I think I probably said most of it before. I think we're talking kind of across testing and commercial deployment, and there are different issues in both of those. I think my experience of testing regulation in Europe is it's too complex. Like at a really basic level, it's far too complex, and we can speak to that from the experience we've got from testing in the UK since 2018, which has a much more straightforward framework and has been really integral to growing the company. Like in the UK, you self-certify according to your own safety case. Whereas whenever we've gone to achieve a permit in another European country, we've stumbled across loads of different challenges, frankly. So whether it's the government not fully understanding its own framework, or not being able to get to the right person to even start the conversation off, it's taking maybe upwards of 6 to 10 months to get a permit. Like, that's just for testing. And I think, you know, it's great that we have all of these commercial frameworks in place, which are largely untested. But if you can't get companies to come and develop the technology in Europe in the first place, you're going to struggle to get people to actually invest time in the commercial framework, and they will just go to jurisdictions that are clearer. I'm not saying it won't happen. I just think we have to be honest about the fact that there is quite a complex kind of member state by member state kind of framework to navigate for companies. And we've found simple things like, if you had one person responsible in a government that you could go to, that you knew was going to be the one to speak to on the topic, that would be really helpful, because you're often, you know, jumping around different people. We've had situations where we're told one thing on one call, and then, you know, we get back a few weeks later and you're told something completely different. And I think that's because we are trialing a technology that doesn't neatly fall in an SE level. Unfortunately, even though the EU doesn't recognise SE levels, typically every member state does use SE levels. So at testing stage, it means that you still have to kind of explain how your technology does or doesn't meet a particular SE level. I think then we really need to look at the differential in risk between safety operator in testing versus safety operator out testing. They're often approached in almost the same way in Europe. You know, I think everyone could agree the level of risk of having a person in the vehicle supervising versus having no one in the vehicle supervising is huge. Yet we will put most of the same kind of requirements on, or at least the same sort of high level process on safety operator in testing. I think my main message in Europe would be, like, there are some easy wins of things that we could do to make it easier in countries to get companies to come and test and develop the technology. But, like, you know, whilst recognizing kind of individual national challenges, and the fact that we need to keep local regulators involved, I totally agree that we need to keep local regulators involved. I just think it needs to be in the right balance, because what we don't want to do is enter into new safety assessments at local level, because actually don't have the expertise, and it will potentially block deployments. Whereas what you want to do is have the safety assessments done by technical experts, the type approval authorities, and then really at the local level you should be working on I got like more kind of community engagement and basically integration issues. So reassuring you know, local stakeholders that the technology is going to bring useful things to their area. But I think the danger is we're potentially not going to meet that kind of outcome. We're actually going to end up in a situation where we're going to have to repeatedly assure the safety of the technology at every level, and that's where it becomes very difficult.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I see your concern. Let me mention that for pre-homologation testing, I mean, some guidelines have been developed on a European level by the Commission. So there is a proposal on the table, you can say, how to facilitate, how to make it easier to come to these testing permits, and then, you know, with this, make it easier that they are mutually recognized by member states. I think they will be published soon, and hopefully they will be applied widely to make it easier, at least here, to get the pre-homologation testing permits and get them mutually recognized. Stefan, you wanted to react?
Yeah, this is not so much of a contradiction, but in addition, or another aspect to what Sarah just said. And there's really, you know, you need to always take into mind that to take into account the different views of the different actors, of the different players, you know, one being industry and one being government and regulators. And that's why I just wanted to rephrase the point. It's important at this point to have a sort of a complementary approach between national regulations and European regulations. Why? Because once the national regulation is there, everybody is learning, you know, the governments, the administrators, the approval authorities, they are learning to approve technologies. And that's, of course, an experience and part of it, part of innovation, which is about as innovative as what is happening in industry, you know, to get governments and to get regulators work and approve technologies. You know, that's a learning process, and that needs to start now and not in a year or two, when further frameworks are in place, you know, as the technology is actually moving very fast. So you need to get acquainted to these kinds of approval processes. And having said all that, of course, the question of the levels is important, because I don't know if it was Elsa or Christina who mentioned the fact it is important to us to know if the driver is in or if the driver is out. So if it's just a level 3, or for the German context, you know, the 2+ discussion that Sarah knows all about, probably, it's important to know what you're approving. If it's a level 4 vehicle, which basically in the outcome is supposed to not have a driver, or if it's just something which is mixed, you know, where the driver can hand over. So that's important. So that's also that's why it's also important to not be so agnostic as in the use case question on the level of sort of automation, even though the levels might not be listed specifically. Having said all that, there's also a question or a difference in the business models. And again, Sarah mentioned, okay, the business model is to sell the system to an OEM or to a motor vehicle manufacturer. That's of course one thing, and that's a bit further from, let's say, the governmental view, where it says, okay, actually we need the technology in place in the context of, for example, public transportation, or in the context of actually having the technology fulfill other roles. And I realize that there is a point in saying, okay, governments know a bit less about business cases than industry actually does. But it's, of course, different views and different approaches. And actually, coming back to my original point, communication is very important, and dialogue is as well, to actually understand the need of each and every player.
Thank you, Stefan. Elsa, you also wanted to react?
Yeah, thank you, Tobias. I just wanted to elaborate a bit on what Sarah's mentioned on the fact that it's not a good way to go forward to ask for local authorities to assess the system, and the system that is going to be driving on the road. So it's why I completely agree with the fact that the national regulation under the EU under the EU is not going to be a sort of duplication or a double check of the safety of the vehicle. I think that it's a complementary framework, in the sense that this vehicle has to be integrated in a transport system. So there is no reason that a local authority will ask for any further checks on the vehicle, on the safety of the vehicle itself, but it's how this vehicle is integrated in a transport system. So I will clearly agree on the sense that we have to harmonize the national frameworks to be sure that it's not going to happen. Thanks.
Yeah, very, very good point. We're nearing the end of our panel. Unfortunately, we don't have much time left, although I think we could discuss for a longer time. But let's use the last minutes to look a little bit into the future. I mean, what can we all do to facilitate deployment and get more vehicles on the road from a regulatory perspective? Christina, can I start with you? Each of you, where you are, what can you do, and what will you do in the future there?
Yes, Tobias, very, very good question. So then in the very next future, we are working on establishing test beds across Europe that will allow commercial deployment, fast commercial deployment under dedicated regulatory sandboxes starting possibly 2026. So we are working with other Commission Directorate Generals, and in particular with the colleagues from DG Move. And then also liaising with industry and member states, of course, to establish at least 3 test beds to allow larger scale deployment compared to what we have now of commercial applications in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Stefan, from a German point of view, you mentioned the new government and the plans you have. What's in there for autonomous mobility in the future?
Well, I'm not a politician to speak for the new government versus the old or anything. I'm really on the working level, but I can say that the strategy that was developed also is on the very specific working level process, and it has developed many aspects which helps us, hopefully helps us, and that includes all of us, including industry and players, science, universities, and everyone, to actually move forward and to develop the technology further. It's important to gain experience with those vehicles on roads, and that, as you know, it includes all aspects from the approval, from the use, and from the and up to the question of what you can actually and how you can actually use it as a business model. In the last 2 weeks, there were 2 actually projects that we are funding as a Germany who started their either their sort of their real operations. That was actually 2 days ago in Frankfurt, the Kira project that was all over in the news, at least here in Germany. They actually now start riding with passengers. And another one was further back in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which also started there, so the developing process. But having said all that, the technology is moving forward, and that's why I'm also thankful for industry to keep working on in this context. We, from the governmental side, we will do our best to gain and learn from the experience that is happening as the technologies are being introduced. But at the same time, of course, we'll learn what improvements need to be made. Now this panel is about regulations. If there, at any case, is too much let's call it bureaucracy at any step, we are very happy to look into that and see what we can improve in the future. And once again, dialogue and communication is important.
Definitely dialogue and communication, and yeah, we need industry, of course, also from a regulatory perspective. Sarah, you're representing industry here in general, you can say, as the only industry person. So from your point of view, what will the future bring, and what needs to be done from a regulatory perspective, which has not been mentioned yet?
Yeah, and I should say, we're on the road in Germany now, and we have our KBA experimental permit. And we actually, once we were in the process, we had a very good experience. I think a lot of my comments are actually around, and thanks to Stefan, who's always been very, very helpful to us. A lot of my comments are actually around when we've tried to take that permit and use it in other places in Europe. I think that's, and obviously we know about the pre-homologation testing work and the harmonized guidelines, and that's why we're so supportive of them. Because actually it was that move to expand tests in other areas in Europe, particularly because we fall in the kind of a level 2+ gray area that no one really likes from a regulatory point of view. So I think we need to see basically that harmonized work really hopefully be cemented and actually used by member states, because I think it will help solve a lot of the challenges that I previously mentioned.
Thank you. Elsa, the last word is with you.
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. And I would like to add something on the other side. We've talked a lot about the vehicle and the technical side, but I would say that for France, the interest that we have is to also look at the other side for the commissioning, is that the PTAs and the local authorities, as already mentioned, we want to involve them and to commit them, and we want to try to build a sort of commitment around Europe to deploy, and that would be also a response to what Christina mentioned for the regulatory sandboxes to allow large-scale deployment around Europe.
Thank you, Elsa. Yeah, that sounds very promising and a good way to move forward here in Europe. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I think it was a really interesting discussion. Apologies that we didn't have time to answer the questions. I think some of them should have been answered by what was said. And the rest, I think we can take after and send maybe the answers by email. Guido, I would hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. So let me thank all the panelists. I found the discussion very insightful and informative. And I think this is the purpose of PAVE Europe, to inform and to support this dialogue and communication. It was mentioned several times. And let me thank you, Tobias, for the moderation and for bringing your experience to the discussion. And thank you to all the participants that joined us today. The recording will be available in our website and the YouTube channel. So for those who couldn't participate, they will have the opportunity to listen to you and the panelists. Thanks again, and see you next time from PAVE Europe. Bye.